German confidence in the Enigma machine did not originate from unfounded perceptions or an excessively optimistic interpretation of its capabilities. Since engineer Arthur Scherbius patented it in 1918, the device underwent a process of technical refinement that made it a central tool for Reich communications. In 1923, the companies Scherbius and Ritter began marketing it as an office machine intended for banks, companies, and diplomatic agencies seeking to protect sensitive information. It was a device that, in appearance, did not differ much from the size and weight of a portable typewriter, with the promise of ensuring the confidentiality of any written exchange. However, the adoption of Enigma by the German Navy in 1926, followed by the Army and the Luftwaffe shortly afterward, transformed the device into a strictly military instrument. From that moment on, its function ceased to be linked to the commercial sphere and became an elemental component of the communicative infrastructure of a state preparing for a conflict of increasing dimensions. The principle of operation of Enigma might have seemed simple when observed from the outside, but inside it operated a complex encryption system shaped by electrical engineering and mathematical combinatorics. The keyboard of 26 letters sent an electrical current towards a set of 3 interchangeable rotors, each with distinct internal wiring that altered the signal according to its design. After passing through the 3 rotors, the current bounced back on a fixed reflector and returned by a different path, finally illuminating a letter on the lamp panel. The operator thus obtained the encrypted version of the letter that had been entered. On the receiving station, a machine configured identically performed the reverse process without the need for additional transformations. This reciprocity facilitated use in the field, allowing the same machine to perform both operations without external adjustments. The fundamental innovation that granted Enigma its reputation for extreme security lay in the automatic movement of the rotors. Each keystroke made the right rotor advance 1 position, altering the internal circuit and therefore the resulting conversion. When the right rotor completed a full turn of 26 positions, the middle rotor advanced 1 step, and when it completed its own cycle, the left rotor did the same. This mechanical progression generated a continuous polyalphabetic cipher. The letter A could be converted into different letters even within the same message, never repeating itself in identical sequences. This variability severely hindered any attempt at frequency analysis, the traditional method used by cryptographers to detect patterns. To this already complex system, a decisive component was added that elevated the security of the device to exceptional levels: the plug board, or steckerbrett. Located on the front of the machine, it allowed pairs of letters to be exchanged via cables that established additional correspondences before entering the rotor system. With 10 cables available to perform 10 letter swaps, the plug board introduced another layer of transformation that added to the internal electrical process. Thus, the work of cryptanalysis became exponentially more difficult. The standard machine offered 5 selectable rotors, of which 3 were chosen in a determined order, generating 60 possible combinations just in that first step. Each rotor could be set in 26 different positions, which produced 17,576 initial states in the position of the rotors. By combining it with the plugboard permutations, the total number of available configurations rose to approximately 150 trillion. In practical terms, even with 1,000 cryptographers testing 1 configuration per second continuously, the total number of combinations exceeded the human and computational capacity of the time. The security provided by these numbers was not simply a propaganda claim. The German military communication networks relied on key sheets that were distributed monthly and specified for each day of the calendar the selection of rotors, their order, the initial ring positions, and the plugboard connections. This daily configuration changed at midnight, so an intercepted message without the corresponding information was unintelligible. Even if an enemy physically captured an Enigma in perfect condition, the absence of the key sheets rendered the device practically useless for deciphering current transmissions. Germany had learned from the decryption of the Zimmermann telegram in 1917, an episode that demonstrated how an effective interception could alter the course of a conflict. During the interwar period, German military doctrine emphasized speed, mobility, and precise coordination between land, air, and naval units. The subsequent concept of blitzkrieg relied entirely on radio transmissions. Tanks advancing on divergent routes needed to receive changes in direction without delays, bombers needed to update coordinates on the ground, and submarines patrolling the Atlantic had to quickly communicate convoy sightings. Wired communications were not an option in wide operational areas, and radio silence prevented the coordination of mobile forces. Enigma seemed to resolve this structural contradiction by allowing open transmissions on radio frequency without their content being readable to those who intercepted them. The German Navy was even more demanding with the security of the system. From 1934 onwards, and widely from February of 1942, the U-boats began using the M4 version, which incorporated a fourth additional rotor. This change generated a significant increase in the number of possible configurations, multiplying the total by a factor of 26. For German cryptographers, this added complexity made any enemy effort to break the encryption mathematically unfeasible. Naval operations depended on coded messages to coordinate group attacks against Allied convoys, and the loss of security in these communications could compromise the entire Atlantic strategy. In addition to the technical design, operational procedures reinforced the security of the system. Each message used not only the daily configuration, but also an individual key selected by the operator. They chose 3 random letters. For example, BRT set the rotors to that position and encrypted the text. The transmitted message included an encrypted indicator informing the receiver of the individual key used, allowing machines at different points on the front to work in sync. In the early years, it was established that this individual key should be encrypted twice in succession, which generated an additional block of 6 letters in each transmission. Although the intention was to reduce operational errors, this procedure introduced a standardized practice that would be repeated in thousands of messages, a detail that would later have unexpected consequences. The culture of secrecy surrounding Enigma was inflexible. Operators were required to sign confidentiality oaths that specified severe penalties, including death, in case of disclosure or negligence. The machines were transported in sealed containers and under surveillance. Key sheets were printed on water-soluble paper to ensure they disappeared if destroyed at sea or exposed to liquids in an emergency situation. Operating instructions prohibited trivial patterns, such as repeating consecutive letters or choosing obvious keyboard combinations. This control aimed to minimize any human error that could offer an adversary an exploitable statistical clue. In 1939, when Germany initiated the invasion of Poland, Enigma had reached an almost unquestionable prestige within the military structure of the Reich. The transmission of orders, position reports, troop movements, updates on land or maritime operations, and administrative communications were routinely carried out through the encrypted system. Mobile units, command centers, and naval forces fully trusted that no enemy had the technical means to penetrate their messages. The transmissions intercepted by the Allies were stored as extensive series of letters with no apparent pattern, seemingly impossible to reverse without the exact daily key. As the conflict expanded beyond Poland and structures on different fronts were reorganized, the intensive use of Enigma took on an everyday rhythm that grew in volume and logistical complexity. German communication networks had to provide updated keys to moving ground units, air bases, naval detachments, and weather stations scattered across occupied territories. Dependence on the system became so deep that it was hard to conceive of an operation without it. The German perception of invulnerability continued even as the volume of transmitted messages increased and the war took new directions in Europe. The confidence in the device was not limited to its technical design, but to a conviction rooted in the combination of precise mechanics, operational discipline, and the volume of available keys forming a barrier that no adversary could scale. The machine seemed to consolidate a balance between strategic mobility and information protection, a balance that supported daily military decisions. However, while the German commands maintained this certainty, the Allies advanced in their own attempts to understand the internal mechanisms of the system, gradually accumulating interceptions and analyzing external patterns in the structure of the transmissions. The signals emitted from terrestrial units, weather stations, and naval fleets were mapping an increasingly dense exchange of data. This continuous growth would define the environment in which soon efforts would emerge, aimed not only at examining the internal functioning of the device, but also the operational flow of communication networks, a process that would develop in parallel to other events that would transform the strategic dimension of the conflict. As the Enigma system became consolidated as the center of German military communications and radio networks increased their volume of transmissions in 1930, European intelligence services tirelessly studied each intercepted signal. In Poland, the constant accumulation of encrypted messages led the General Staff to conclude that the German threat was evolving rapidly, and that the ability to interpret these transmissions would be decisive in any future conflict. Poland was in a strategically vulnerable position, located between the Soviet Union to the east and a Germany moving towards sustained rearmament in the west. The Polish authorities understood that information, more than any territorial advantage, would be the element that would allow them to anticipate military movements and adverse political decisions. With that conviction, the Cipher Bureau of the General Staff began a search for solutions that would transcend traditional cryptanalysis techniques, incapable of penetrating the messages generated by a machine whose exact operation was still shrouded in mystery. At the end of the 1920s, Polish analysts had proven that methods based on linguistic patterns were insufficient. The intercepted German transmissions showed sequences of letters with no apparent repetition and without the structure that allowed for isolating regularities in previous codes. The techniques that had worked against manual ciphers revealed no relationship among the intercepted fragments. The internal assessment was clear. If the enemy produced messages by means of an electrical mechanism capable of generating continuous mathematical transformations, the only viable response had to come from an equally mathematical approach. This conclusion led Major Guido Langer and Captain Maximilian Ciężki to adopt a novel strategy for the time. In January of 1929, Ciężki initiated the creation of a secret cryptology course at the Adam Mickiewicz University of Poznań. The choice of the city had practical and operational bases. Poznań had belonged to the German Empire before 1918, which made it easier to find students familiar with the German language. Furthermore, the university had a solid mathematics department developed during the 1920s. The course was camouflaged as a conventional academic seminar, but its real purpose was to identify young people capable of applying algebraic reasoning to unprecedented problems. Of the attendees of that course, 3 students demonstrated exceptional skills: Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rojicki, and Henryk Zygalski. The Cipher Bureau recruited them first partially, then full-time. Each one possessed complementary capabilities. Rejewski, born in 1905, had a background in statistics and had studied at the University of Göttingen, where he became familiar with advanced developments in group theory, an area of abstract algebra of increasing relevance in Europe. Rojicki, born in 1909, contributed analytical intuition capable of detecting relationships in complex structures. Zygalski, born in 1907, excelled in geometric visualization, which would later become crucial for designing supporting mechanical tools. By the end of 1932, the 3 were already working in Warsaw, where the Bureau Cyfrów assigned them a discrete laboratory and limited access to captured or acquired material on Enigma. The group only had a commercial Enigma, different from the German military version, which included substantial modifications in the rotors and, above all, the plug board. Without knowing those precise details, the mathematical reconstruction of the system seemed unattainable. The interceptions grew each month, but transforming them into useful information required determining the exact internal structure of the military machine. In those early stages, the efforts produced only fragments of hypotheses that did not fit into a uniform scheme. The situation changed when French intelligence intervened. Between 1931 and 1932, the French officer Gustave Bertrand managed to recruit Hans Thilo Schmidt, an employee of the German cipher office in Berlin. Schmidt delivered operation manuals and key sheets corresponding to September and October of 1932 to the French. France shared these documents with Great Britain and with Poland, but the British did not achieve significant advances. Poland, however, had a crucial advantage. The Poznan group was prepared to tackle the problem from a systematic mathematical perspective. On the 15th of December 1932, the documents arrived at the Warsaw laboratory and Rejewski began to analyze them. The provided keys allowed establishing equations comparing the known plaintext with its corresponding encrypted version. Rejewski interpreted each Enigma configuration as a permutation of the alphabet, which allowed him to introduce the problem into the framework of group theory. The plug board added additional permutations, but these could be mathematically isolated to first study the joint action of the rotors. The set of internal transformations generated patterns that, although hidden to the naked eye, corresponded to well-defined algebraic structures. The key discovery did not come from a technical failure of the machine, but from a flaw in the German operational procedures. At that time, the operators encrypted their individual message key twice in a row. If an operator chose BRT, the machine produced a sequence of 6 letters that contained a direct mathematical relationship between the initial and final positions of the encryption. Rejewski observed that, by collecting multiple messages from the same day, it was possible to detect pairs of letters that shared the same transformation with a fixed shift. Each day, with the same daily configuration, the operational repetitions generated recurrent patterns that could be grouped into specific chains. These chains, called characteristics, varied according to the rotor positions. To identify the daily configuration through the features, Rejewski needed a catalogue that collected the chain structure for the possible positions of the 3 rotors. Aware of the magnitude of the work, he designed the cyclometer, a machine capable of mechanically calculating the length and number of cycles associated with each of the 105,456 possible configurations. The construction of the catalogue required approximately 1 year of work, but once completed, it allowed for quickly determining the selection and order of the rotors used on any day, using only the collected interceptions. The catalogue provided the missing element to solve the system. With the position of the rotors known, Rejewski was able to mathematically deduce the secret internal wiring of the military rotors, an extraordinary achievement he accomplished without physically accessing a military machine. This discovery placed Poland at the forefront of European cryptanalysis. In January of 1933, the Bureau Cyfrów began reading German messages continuously. For more than 6 years, while the Nazi regime consolidated its internal control and advanced its rearmament program, Poland gained direct access to communications, including staff orders, unit movement reports, and internal assessments of various operations. The German system, however, did not remain static. In October of 1936, Germany increased the frequency of key changes. From an initial quarterly scheme, it moved to a monthly one, and finally daily. The number of connections available on the plug board also increased from 6 to 10. In 1937, the reflector's modification required recalculating the internal permutations. Later, in December of 1938, 2 additional rotors were added, expanding the set to 5. With this, the number of possible combinations grew exponentially. The methodology based on the catalogue ceased to be sufficient to process the volume of possibilities within the times required for daily operational analysis. Faced with this obstacle, Rejewski developed a new device in October of 1938, the cryptologic bomb. It was an electromechanical machine designed to explore rotor settings in parallel. Warsaw built 6 bombs, each one dedicated to one of the 6 possible arrangements of 3 selected rotors. They worked simultaneously, checking if certain configurations matched features observed in the intercepted messages. When the machine found a match, it stopped, indicating the possible correct configuration for that day. In parallel, Zygalski developed an additional method, the perforated sheets. Each sheet was a matrix of 51 by 51 positions, with specific perforations for particular configurations. By superimposing several sheets corresponding to different messages, the overlays revealed points where the permutations coincided. This method allowed for the identification of configurations even when the complexity of the plugboard made other approaches difficult. By 1938, Poland was managing to decipher approximately 75% of the intercepted German transmissions. The German technical advances gradually reduced this percentage, but the Bureau Sifrov maintained its operational capacity thanks to the combination of bombs and perforated sheets. The problem arose when the mathematical demands of the 5-rotor system exceeded the available resources. To cover all combinations, Poland would have needed 60 bombs and a proportional system of sheets, a volume impossible to sustain in a country with limited resources and under direct threat of invasion. Faced with this situation, on the 26th and 27th of July of 1939, in a secret meeting held in the forest of Pyry near Warsaw, Polish representatives handed over all their research to French and British intelligence delegations. They presented methods, calculations, devices, punched cards, and full replicas of the military Enigma. For the British and French, this knowledge represented an unexpected qualitative leap, as their own efforts had not achieved comparable advances. For Poland, the decision was in response to an immediate strategic necessity. It was evident that the German invasion was imminent, and the Polish cryptological structures were at risk of being destroyed. By transferring their work to countries with greater industrial and geographical capacity to continue the effort, Poland ensured the continuity of a project that had consumed 7 years of intensive research. 5 weeks later, on the 1st of September of 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Radzewski, Rojicki, and Zygalski escaped through Romania to France, where they continued decryption at PC Brno Station. The reorganization of Allied efforts on French territory would mark the next stage in the evolution of cryptanalysis against Enigma, in a context where the speed of military operations and the expansion of the conflict in Europe would necessitate redesigning procedures and analysis centers to handle an increasingly large volume of interceptions. As Polish mathematicians reorganized their operations after escaping the German invasion, and the British began to integrate the knowledge received in Pyry, the Government Code and Cipher School needed a space to consolidate a growing cryptologic effort. This need led to the acquisition of a Victorian mansion in Buckinghamshire, located about 80 kilometres northwest of London. Admiral Hugh Sinclair, head of the Secret Intelligence Service, paid £6,000 from his own pocket in 1938 to secure the property before other government entities questioned an expense whose purpose could not yet be openly described. The location was strategic, close enough to London to ensure communication and transport, but far enough to reduce risks in case of bombing. The railway line connecting Oxford and Cambridge facilitated the constant arrival of specialists, and the relative isolation allowed operations to proceed without attracting attention. When the Government Code and Cipher School completed its move to Bletchley Park in August of 1939, war was imminent. The transformation of the place had already begun. The main mansion quickly became overcrowded, and wooden buildings known as huts were erected, designed to house specialized teams. Huts dedicated to analysis, others to translation, others to deciphering, all connected by narrow paths where messengers cycled and staff transported documents via pneumatic tubes or teleprinters. From the outside, nothing suggested the magnitude of the work that would soon unfold inside. The British arrived with experience accumulated during the First World War, particularly from Room 40, responsible for deciphering German naval communications and the Zimmermann telegram. Some veterans were among the first members of the Bletchley team. Dilwyn "Dilly" Knox, a prominent figure from the earlier period, had studied the commercial Enigma since 1937 and developed preliminary methods to attack simplified versions used by Italians and Spanish nationalists. Nonetheless, the German military Enigma, equipped with a plug board, had resisted all British attempts. The material delivered by the Poles in July of 1939 showed that their own approaches had been directed in a direction too slow for the timelines demanded by the war. The recruitment that followed was unusual by British military standards. Mathematicians from Cambridge and Oxford, experts in Germanic languages, chess champions, complex crossword solvers, and academics from various disciplines received discreet calls to attend confidential interviews. Some were invited to solve crosswords under a time limit as a test of analytical aptitude. Those who passed these assessments signed the Official Secrets Act without fully knowing the nature of the work. Intellectual diversity was part of the strategy. Minds capable of reasoning under pressure, detecting structures, formulating hypotheses, and rapidly reviewing methods were sought. Among the recruits, Alan Matheson Turing stood out, who arrived in Bletchley on the 4th of September 1939. At 27 years old, Turing had proposed in 1936 the notion of the universal machine, a theoretical model capable of executing any computational process. That abstraction proved crucial in an environment where the question was no longer whether a code could be broken, but how many operations were necessary to find the correct configuration among thousands of millions of possibilities. Bletchley needed an approach that leveraged mathematical logic and mechanical strength working together. Turing was assigned to Hut 8, dedicated to the German naval communications. There he worked alongside Hugh Alexander and, later on, with large teams of analysts. Hut 6 was responsible for the Army and Luftwaffe communications under the coordination of Gordon Welchman. Hut 3 processed and analyzed the decrypted content. Hut 4 did the same with the messages of the Kriegsmarine. This organization by specialties allowed the work to be divided into clearly defined stages, but it depended on strict coordination for the information to flow correctly between teams. Unlike rigid military structures, Bletchley operated through constantly adapting work chains, which favored quick adjustments to changes in the German systems. Turing's first challenge was to replace the Polish method based on the double encryption of the message key. In May of 1940, the Germans eliminated that practice, and its modification rendered the Polish bombs obsolete. Turing designed a new approach centered on a concept known as a crib, probable plain text fragments that could appear in encrypted messages, weather reports, standardized phrases, repetitive formats, and operational habits of the German operators generated opportunities to find matches between plain text and encrypted text. When analysts identified a plausible crib, they could construct logical chains that determined which rotor settings could transform it into the intercepted sequence of letters. The new machine created to exploit these cribs was the British bomb. The first prototype, called Victory, was installed in March of 1940. It measured nearly 2 meters high and wide, weighed more than 1 ton, and contained about 100 drums that simulated the behavior of the Enigma rotors. Cables and internal connections allowed for exploring different configurations quickly, reducing what would have previously required weeks of manual calculation to minutes or hours. Gordon Welchman introduced a decisive improvement, the diagonal board, which accelerated the search by exploiting the reciprocal nature of the German plug board. With this addition implemented in August of 1940, the bomb became an instrument sufficiently fast to keep up with the daily key changes. The process began when traffic analysts selected a message with a solid crib. That crib was transformed into a logical sequence that fed the bomb bay. The machine then tested rotor settings, advancing drums, and evaluating electrical connections until it found a configuration consistent with the crib-cipher relationship. When it identified a possibility, it stopped. The result was verified using a real Enigma configured according to the suggested parameters. If the deciphered text made coherent sense in military German, the day's key was established. Determining the exact plugboard connections required additional steps, but the volume of possibilities was manageable once the rotor positions were fixed. The number of bombes increased rapidly. By mid-1940 there were several in operation. In 1942 there were dozens. In 1944, more than 200 bombers were operating in Bletchley and associated stations. Cooperation with the United States multiplied that capacity when the National Cash Register Company assembled faster bombs in Dayton, Ohio. Meanwhile, interception stations, known as Y stations, distributed German traffic to Bletchley without interruption. These stations recorded signals in Morse, closed each transmission with time, origin, and frequency, and sent the digital or mechanical records to the analysis center. Although many messages could not be deciphered immediately, their mere existence served to create activity maps. The deciphered information was sent to intelligence analysis units under the codename Ultra. These reports were carefully drafted to conceal their origin. The commanders who received them rarely knew they came from German messages read almost in real time. The different sections of Bletchley were kept compartmentalized. The decipherers did not have access to later military decisions. The analysts did not know the technical details behind the deciphering. This structure prevented leaks and reduced the risk of German intelligence deducing that Enigma had been compromised. In 1940, Bletchley successfully deciphered several Army and Luftwaffe networks. It also managed to penetrate Dolphin, a naval network used in European waters. However, the Kriegsmarine introduced in February of 1942 a four-rotor system known as Shark, used by the U-boats in the Atlantic. The new configuration caused a 10-month intelligence blackout. During that period, Allied convoys traveled without knowing the positions of the German submarines. The sunken tonnage reached critical levels that put at risk Great Britain's ability to sustain the war. The reconstruction of the ability to decipher Shark became an absolute priority. The growth of the staff reflected the expansion of the work. From about 150 employees in 1939, Bletchley grew to nearly 10,000 by 1944. Approximately 75% were women, responsible for operating bombs, traffic analysis, translation, and document management. Many came from women's colleges, selected for their analytical speed and accuracy. Their contributions were essential to maintaining operational pace, although for decades they remained classified as clerical staff, hiding their true technical role. The secrecy permeated daily life at Bletchley. Those who worked there rarely shared information, even with close colleagues. Security extended many years after the conflict. Families were unaware of what their members had done during the war, and the workers themselves remained silent until the declassification of documents in the 1970s. That collective silence had protected a fundamental resource, the Allied ability to read enemy communications, while the Germans fully trusted the inviolability of Enigma. The advance against Shark and the adaptation of new machines and methods would configure the next phase of the cryptological effort, at a time when the war in the Atlantic and the preparation of operations in Western Europe required increasingly precise and fast information. As Bletchley Park gradually regained the ability to decrypt German naval communications in late 1942, the situation in the North Atlantic reached critical levels. The maritime traffic linking North America with Great Britain constituted the only route to sustain industrial activity, civilian supply, and British military preparation. Each convoy crossing the ocean carried essential cargo: fuel, food, mechanical parts, ammunition, vehicles, and raw materials that could not be stored indefinitely. The continuity of the war effort depended on keeping that maritime corridor open, and during the first months of 1942, the indicators showed that the supply line was at real risk of collapse. The physical conditions of the crossing were severe. In winter, the surface waters dropped to temperatures close to 4 degrees Celsius. which drastically limited the survival time of any crew member who had to abandon a damaged ship. Torpedo impacts caused structural damage that could fracture hulls, disrupt watertight compartments, and cause fires in fuel tanks. The convoys, usually made up of 30 or 40 merchant ships, advanced escorted by destroyers and corvettes, but the area to protect was too large, and anti-submarine means were still in the development phase. The darkness, adverse weather, and lack of sophisticated sensors increased the difficulties of detection. During the night hours, the German threat reached its most dangerous point. The statistics corresponding to the first half of 1942 showed alarming increases in the tonnage sunk. In March, 82 ships disappeared, with an approximate total of 476,000 tons lost. Each sinking meant less fuel available for the RAF, less industrial capacity to produce armoured vehicles and aircraft, and fewer civilian supplies in a country that depended entirely on maritime traffic. The War Cabinet received periodic reports that underlined that if the trend continued, Britain's energy reserves could be depleted in a matter of months. These calculations generated internal discussions about the feasibility of sustaining the war in a scenario where the logistical flow was completely interrupted. The temporary collapse in Ultra's ability to decipher German naval communications coincided with the peak operational expansion of the U-boats. On the 1st of February 1942, the Kriegsmarine implemented the Enigma M4 model for units operating in the Atlantic. The fourth rotor introduced in the M4 increased the possible combinations by a factor of 26, cancelling out the methods that Bletchley had developed for the three-rotor version. The bombs, optimized to test three-rotor configurations, could not process in due time the new mathematical volume necessary to cover the fourth. This caused a 10-month naval intelligence blackout, the period during which the U-boats reached their highest effectiveness. The tactics of the U-boats under the command of Admiral Karl Dönitz were based on patrols distributed in transverse lines over the predicted convoy routes. One submarine acted as a detection point. When it located a convoy, it transmitted its position and course by radio. Dönitz centralized the coordination from France, ordering the convergence of additional submarines until sufficient units were gathered for a night attack. The operations were carried out on the surface to take advantage of the greater speed of the submarine in that condition, and the low silhouette made visual detection difficult. The Allied escorts had to locate targets that combined mobility, low visual signature, and the ability to dive when the attack was completed. This dependency of the German system on radio communications constituted at the same time a significant potential vulnerability. During 1941, when Bletchley could read the three-rotor naval code, the convoys were frequently rerouted before entering enemy patrol areas. The losses decreased notably, and the reports of U-boat activity showed a clear decrease in successful contacts. Dönitz, puzzled by this reduction, repeatedly consulted his cryptographic experts, who reaffirmed that Enigma was mathematically secure. These consultations influenced the decision to introduce the M4, considered a sufficient advance to close any possible gap, although without concrete evidence that there was a real compromise of the system. Another adverse factor was added to the Allied blackout. B-Dienst, the German Naval Cryptological Service, managed to decipher the Allied Naval Cipher No. 3, used for the coordination of convoy routes. This allowed the Germans to know Allied movement patterns between February and June of 1943, placing Dönitz at an operational advantage. The losses increased during the weeks when both systems operated simultaneously in favor of the Kriegsmarine. Convoys such as SC-121, SC-122, and HX-229 suffered continuous attacks that generated accumulated losses of 22 ships over a period of a few days. Without ultra-intelligence, and with their own codes compromised, the Allies went through the most dangerous stage of the entire maritime campaign. The restoration of decryption capability came thanks to physical captures of German material. The first occurred on the 9th of May, 1941, when the destroyer HMS Bulldog forced U-110 to surface. the boarding team recovered an Enigma machine and technical documentation that proved crucial months later. A second and even more significant capture took place on the 30th of October, 1942. After attacking U-559 in the Mediterranean, a British team entered the interior of the damaged submarine and recovered code books shortly before the hull sank. Among the materials obtained was the shorthand weather key book, the Wetterkurzschlüssel, used to transmit encrypted atmospheric reports in a predictable format. This predictability allowed for the generation of reliable cribs, which provided Bletchley with the structure needed to adapt its methods to the Enigma M4. Turing and the Hut 8 team analysed the function of the fourth rotor and determined that it acted as an extension of the reflector, not as a conventional rotor. This feature reduced the effective search space. Once the new methods for integrating cribs derived from meteorological messages were incorporated, the adapted bombs began to produce consistent results. On the 13th of December 1942, Bletchley transmitted to the Admiralty an estimated map of U-boat positions in the Atlantic, based solely on decrypted shark signals. Ultra had regained its operational capability over the most critical target. The impact was immediate. In the first months of 1943, the convoys began to deviate again around the concentrations of U-boats. Losses diminished while the capability of anti-submarine groups increased. Escort carriers could head to specific areas where submarine activity was expected, optimizing the deployment of aircraft equipped with radar and anti-submarine weaponry. The combined forces sank 15 U-boats between June and August of 1943, a significant number compared to previous months. Although the Germans attributed their losses to Allied technological improvements, ultra-intelligence provided the data that allowed the submarines to be located and confronted with increasing effectiveness. The decisive change occurred in May of 1943. That month, the Allies sank 41 U-boats in the North Atlantic and lost only 7 merchant ships. On May 24th, Dönitz ordered the withdrawal of his wolf packs from the northern sector of the Atlantic. The German losses had reached a threshold that made it unsustainable to continue previous tactics. The Kriegsmarine referred to that period as Schwarzer Mai, Black May. Although the U-boats continued to operate in other regions for the remainder of the war, the strategic battle for the supply lines had concluded. The Allies now maintained a stable logistical corridor that allowed for the preparation and execution of large-scale operations in Western Europe. Security around Ultra remained strict. The need to protect the source required creating alternative explanations for each action, derived from the use of decrypted intelligence. When planning to attack a U-boat, reconnaissance planes were sent beforehand, so that the enemy could attribute the detection to aerial sighting. Only about 30 senior commanders received Ultra information, always in redacted versions that removed technical references. This compartmentalization prevented the Germans from suspecting significant compromises in Enigma. Post-war interrogations confirmed that German confidence in the system remained firm until the end of the conflict, even when their naval forces experienced continuous losses. The restoration of ultra-intelligence in 1943 not only changed the course of the naval battle, but also generated an increasing volume of information whose management would require new methods of analysis, coordination between commands, and more organized processing centers to handle operational flows that were increasingly complex. The restoration of Ultra capability at the end of 1942 not only allowed the Allies to regain control over the Atlantic, but also provided the foundations for a cycle of strategic planning that would reach its peak in 1944. As the steady flow of information from Bletchley Park increasingly clarified the internal structure of the German command, Allied planners adapted their operations with increasing precision. In this context, the preparation for the invasion of northwestern Europe required not only military strength, but also the calculated manipulation of enemy perceptions. The accumulation of loads, personnel, shipping, and vehicles in British ports was impossible to conceal. The strategic problem was to ensure that the German High Command misinterpreted this evidence during the critical period preceding the landing. The southeast of England became the setting for a deception program designed to induce errors in German estimation. In 1944, extensive areas near Kent and Sussex were adapted to host structures that mimicked real military installations. Carefully sized inflatable tank models were installed to match the scale of authentic vehicles. Dummy airfields accommodated replicas of aircraft constructed with wood and canvas, visible from reconnaissance aircraft. In other areas, a network of antennas was set up to transmit simulated radio signals, producing constant traffic corresponding to that of a large army. This apparent activity was part of the effort to create the illusion of the first United States Army Group, supposedly led by George S. Patton. Patton's reputation as an offensive commander, widely recognized by the Germans, reinforced the credibility of this fictitious device. The set of operations was grouped under the name Operation Bodyguard, whose purpose was to disperse German attention. Bodyguard included a central component, Fortitude South, aimed at maintaining the perception that the main landing would take place in Pas-de-Calais. This region, located at the narrowest point of the English Channel, represented the route that German analysts considered most logical for a massive invasion. Fortitude North, the complementary component, sought to sustain the impression that there was the threat of an operation in Norway, which would force Germany to retain divisions in a geographical area unrelated to Allied plans. The strategic utility of both operations lay in keeping German forces dispersed during the period in which the Allies concentrated their logistical resources and troops for the execution of Operation Overlord. Ultra allowed the effectiveness of each phase of these deception maneuvers to be verified. The German messages encrypted using Enigma and transmitted between units, intermediate commands, and the Wehrmacht were intercepted and deciphered by Bletchley Park. This reading provided immediate information on how the enemy interpreted the artificial indicators produced by Fortitude. When the codebreakers detected internal German discussions about a possible attack on Norway, the Allied planners confirmed that Fortitude North was producing the desired effect. When the High Command's assessments leaned towards the possibility of an attack on Calais, the direct impact of Fortitude South was recorded. This ability to measure the enemy's response with daily precision allowed the details of the deception operation to be adjusted without the need for indirect inferences. Traditional military doctrine had rarely relied on feedback of this nature. The MI5 double-agent system complemented this verification scheme. The majority of the spies sent by Germany to the United Kingdom had been captured and turned into controlled agents. A central figure within this network was Juan Pujol Garcia, known by his code name Garbo. Pujol maintained a fictitious sub-agent structure whose geographical reach was, in reality, non-existent. His reports mixed verifiable data with conclusions aimed at reinforcing erroneous perceptions about the location, intention, and capability of Allied forces. The accumulation of carefully prepared reports generated extraordinary credibility among the German intelligence services. This trust allowed that, during the days preceding the landing, the messages sent by Garbo consolidated the idea that any initial attack on Normandy would constitute a distraction aimed at covering up the main attack against Calais. On June 5th, 1944, hours before the final order for Operation Overlord was issued, a message deciphered by Bletchley Park confirmed that Fortitude South had successfully influenced the German interpretation of the situation. The message indicated that Hitler had instructed Erwin Rommel to keep divisions in Calais and to consider any landing in Normandy as a preliminary maneuver. The interception made it clear that the panzer divisions stationed in Calais would not be moved to reinforce Normandy during the initial period of the invasion. This reading was transmitted with priority to Eisenhower and the joint planners, who had already calculated that the German retention of these forces would significantly increase the probability of consolidating a beachhead. In the early morning of the 6th of June, while the Allied units approached in amphibious formations towards the beaches of Normandy, the German intelligence continued to maintain the interpretation that the operation constituted a preliminary deployment. The reaction of the German High Command followed the pattern anticipated by Ultra. During the first few weeks, the more numerous armoured divisions remained concentrated in Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never occur. This allowed the Allied forces to disembark heavy equipment, expand their defensive perimeters, and advance inland. When the German commands finally recognized that the main attack had already occurred, the tactical situation had changed irreversibly. Ultra had demonstrated its strategic relevance on various fronts before D-Day. In North Africa, from mid-1942, the communications of the Africa Corps revealed logistical arrangements, fuel requests, projected movements, and situation assessments in different sectors. These interceptions provided Montgomery with detailed information about Rommel's limitations, including reduced fuel levels and supply difficulties. During the Second Battle of El Alamein, this intelligence allowed specific positions to be reinforced and counterattacks to be anticipated. The Allied interpretation of the enemy's logistical conditions became a central element of operational planning in that theatre. The Mediterranean offered additional examples of the direct impact of Ultra. Axis forces depended on a constant flow of supplies coming from Italy. The transmissions of the convoys carrying food, ammunition, fuel, and mechanical parts were systematically read. Once the messages were deciphered, Allied air and naval units acted on expected positions and confirmed routes. The percentage of loss of Axis supplies reached critical proportions, directly affecting the German operational capacity. The reduction in fuel availability for mechanized units in Africa was directly related to the interceptions processed at Bletchley Park. In Europe, Ultra also provided access to high-level communications between different German military branches and between Berlin and commanders on the ground. The messages included internal analyses on industrial production, armament priorities, and threat assessments on different fronts. This information was summarized and sent daily to the British government in sealed packages, distributed to a limited number of authorized officials. In meetings between Churchill and his advisors, these assessments influenced the formation of operational policies and inter-Allied cooperation. Although some of this intelligence was selectively shared with the Soviet Union, the exact source remained hidden, and alternative explanations were attributed to protect the existence of Ultra. When German forces surrendered, and on the 8th of May of 1945 victory in Europe was officially announced, public celebrations marked the visible closure of the conflict on the continent. However, in the buildings of Bletchley Park, the atmosphere was different. The staff who had worked in continuous shifts for years to decipher German communications could not participate in public speeches nor in open recognitions. The obligations imposed by the Official Secrets Act remained in force without any modification. Operation Ultra, which had accompanied almost the entire duration of the conflict, remained strictly classified. The existence of the bombs, of the teams specialized in traffic analysis, of those who translated intercepted messages and organized information indices, had to be kept out of any public account. With the end of the war in Europe, thousands of men and women returned to civilian life with the explicit instruction never to disclose the details of their work. After the German capitulation, British and American intelligence services began a systematic process to locate all Enigma machines that could still be found in European territory. During the conflict, thousands of units had been distributed among the Army, the Luftwaffe, the Kriegsmarine, and administrative bodies of the Reich. Many had been left in abandoned military depots, others in shelters damaged by bombings, and numerous units had been relocated by retreating troops. Allied teams scoured recently occupied areas, inspected arsenals, acquired machines from civilians who had obtained surplus military material, and identified complete batches in facilities where the inventory had become disorganized. The operational objective was twofold: to prevent third countries from accessing the technology and to prevent any external actor from reconstructing the system without supervision from London or Washington. The collection of these machines quickly turned into a broader strategy. During the early years of the post-war period, the United Kingdom began delivering Enigma machines to countries seeking to establish their own cryptographic systems. Newly independent states in Asia and Africa adopted these machines as standard tools for diplomatic and military communications. Enigma's reputation as a secure system, consolidated during the war by German propaganda, favored its adoption. What these nations did not know was that British and American intelligence services retained the technical capability to decipher that traffic. This allowed both governments to access communications between countries that were defining diplomatic positions, negotiating resources, or adjusting alliances amidst the rise of the Cold War. The operational paradox lay in the fact that a system insufficient to protect German communications during the war was now transformed into a security tool for other states that were unaware of its vulnerabilities. The secrecy policy was maintained strictly from the first day of the post-conflict. In the weeks following VE Day, the British government sent direct instructions to former ultra-intelligence recipients, indicating that no reference should appear in publications, conferences, or personal statements. Churchill clearly remembered experiences from the previous post-war period. In the 1920s, details about decrypted Soviet communications had been carelessly revealed, causing Moscow to modify its cryptographic systems and leaving British analysts without access for years. That loss of intelligence was considered a serious strategic mistake and should not be repeated under any circumstances. Added to this reasoning was another factor. Many of the mathematical principles used to attack Enigma were still relevant for contemporary systems. Disclosing specific methods would have allowed inferring vulnerabilities of codes used by countries whose messages London and Washington wanted to keep reading. The result was a persistent void in the public history of the war. The military narratives produced in the years following described campaigns, command decisions, strategic movements, and operational outcomes without incorporating the cryptological dimension that had influenced a substantial part of the conflict. This omission affected the understanding of numerous operations and diverted attention towards incomplete interpretations. Commanders who had based decisions on intelligence derived from Ultra appeared in the records as if they had acted solely on tactical judgment or personal experience. The effect of this invisibility was long-lasting and altered the public perception of the role that information had played in the defeat of the Third Reich. The Polish mathematicians who had taken the first steps in deciphering also did not receive public recognition for decades. Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Różycki, and Henryk Zygalski had achieved the first significant break of the German system in 1932. But the combination of British secrecy and political circumstances in Poland prevented their work from being disclosed. After the war, communist-controlled Poland avoided mentioning contributions that linked the country with Western intelligence operations. The three mathematicians continued with discrete professional activities, unable to reveal their participation in one of the most significant cryptological achievements of the 20th century. Różycki had passed away in 1942, but Rejewski and Zygalski lived long enough to see the belated recognition of their role when the archives began to open decades later. The female staff of Bletchley Park faced a similar fate. Approximately 75% of those who worked there were women tasked with operating bombs, organizing massive indexes of information, analyzing radio traffic, performing translations, and maintaining essential technical processes. However, to conform to the labor norms of the time, many were officially registered as administrative employees. For years, their actual responsibilities remained invisible. The declassification of the files and subsequent historical studies allowed for the reconstruction of the technical level of their contributions. Names like Joan Clark, Mavis Lever, Margaret Rock, and Eleanor Ireland emerged in research that demonstrated that much of the daily decryption depended on female teams whose precision and discipline were decisive in maintaining the continuity of the work. The wall of silence began to gradually weaken in the 1970s. In 1974, the publication of the book The Ultra Secret by F.W. Winterbotham constituted the first wide revelation of the existence of Ultra. Winterbotham had been responsible during the war for distributing intelligence derived from the decrypts and considered that, after decades, the information could be made public. His book had an immediate impact. The news that the Allies had been continuously reading German communications for years changed the perception of large sectors of the population and stimulated new research. The British government reacted by initiating a process of gradual declassification that released documents kept in secret archives since the start of the war. With the new availability of information, the technical figures of Bletchley Park began to slowly become part of the historiography of the conflict. The work of Alan Turing, little known outside specialized circles, progressively gained recognition. His role in the design of the bomb bay and his theoretical contribution to the concept of universal computation were documented with greater precision. His death in 1954, at 41 years old, became the object of historical investigation. Turing had faced a legal process in 1952 due to his homosexuality, then illegal in the United Kingdom. Condemned to undergo mandatory hormonal treatment, he died 2 years later from cyanide poisoning. The official interpretation pointed to a suicide, although discussions persist about the exact circumstances. In 2009, the British government issued an official apology, and in 2013, a posthumous pardon was granted. His name became associated with the most prestigious award in computer science, recognizing his fundamental role in the theoretical foundation of the field. The declassification also allowed Polish contributions to be fully integrated into the historical narrative. The works of Rejewski, Rojicki, and Zygalski were studied in depth and received official tributes. Rejewski lived until 1980 and was able to witness the international recognition that his contribution had acquired. Methods like the cyclometer, perforated sheets, and the cryptologiczna bomb went from being classified knowledge to becoming part of the formal study of the history of cryptography. The technological legacy of Bletchley Park extended beyond the deciphering of Enigma. The creation of Colossus in 1943 aimed at attacking the Lorenz encryption used by the German High Command, incorporated vacuum tubes and logical processing techniques that transformed the way of handling large volumes of information. This device anticipated fundamental aspects of modern computing. Although Colossus was not a general-purpose machine, its ability to execute programmable operations influenced subsequent developments that would define the digital age. The idea of using electronic systems to apply formal rules repeatedly and swiftly was consolidated at Bletchley Park. The accumulated experience also provided lasting lessons on cryptographic security. The case of Enigma demonstrated that the mathematical strength of a system does not guarantee its invulnerability. The German reliance on the internal complexity of the mechanism ignored principles that would later be formalized, among them that security must reside in the key and not in the secret design. Operational errors, repetitive procedures, predictable selection of settings, and excessive reliance on the machinery contributed to vulnerabilities that the Allies were able to exploit. These lessons retained value in later decades, especially when new technologies began to depend on cryptographic systems distributed on a global scale. As more documents were declassified, the historical understanding of the war expanded, incorporating a dimension that had remained hidden for decades. Ground, air, and naval operations began to be reinterpreted in light of the intelligence that supported them. The systematic interception of communications, their analysis, and the ability to act quickly on critical information were revealed as central elements in the development of the conflict. Ultra ceased to be a marginal piece and became fundamental in explaining how strategic decisions were made throughout the entire war. The study of Enigma's legacy continues to expand. The archives remain the subject of historical research, revealing connections between cryptological warfare, the reorganization of the international system, and the subsequent development of security and communication technologies. In that process, the work of those who operated at Bletchley Park, the Polish mathematicians, and the Allied analysts is progressively integrated into a more complete understanding of how information can influence large-scale conflicts and shape subsequent transformations whose scope is still being investigated.